The shooting range was always a place where people went to show off their skills, and today was no different. Located in a high-end neighborhood, this range was filled with the sound of loud gunshots as shooters, mostly young men, lined up to take their shots. The walls were lined with trophies, their gold plaques shining in the bright lights. Expensive equipment lay neatly arranged on the counters, all available for anyone who could afford the steep membership fee. The air smelled of gunpowder, and the floor was polished to perfection, reflecting the light above. The shooters who regularly visited this range were some of the best in the area. Most were proud of their abilities, and some were downright cocky. Every day, they competed to see who could hit the furthest target, with no one daring to question their skills. The more experienced ones showed off their perfect stances, flaunting their sniper rifles with a sense of superiority. Every time they hit a target, their friends would cheer, praising them for their accuracy. It was a space where being the best was not just a goal but a lifestyle. That was when she entered. An elderly woman, no more than 5 feet tall, stepped through the entrance. Her clothes were simple, a faded cardigan over a loose blouse and dark slacks. She moved slowly, carrying a well-worn bag in her hand. Her face was lined with age, wrinkles that spoke of years of experience, but her eyes were calm, almost serene. There was nothing about her appearance that screamed expert shooter. In fact, she seemed out of place in this flashy, high-tech range full of young, muscular men and women dressed in the latest shooting gear. The shooters at the range didn't know what to think when they saw her. At first, they glanced at each other, raising an eyebrow in surprise. They whispered among themselves, wondering if she had wandered in by mistake. Was she just here to watch? Did she even know how to use a gun? One of them, a young man with a cocky grin, turned to his friend and whispered, "Bet she's just here to make up the numbers. Probably never even held a rifle before." The shooting range had become unusually quiet. The usual chatter, the playful insults, and the sound of gunshots had all faded away. Instead, there was a strange air of awe hanging over the place. Everyone's eyes were on the old woman, who stood there, poised and calm, her rifle resting gently in her hands. The range was quiet now, the echoes of gunshots and laughter long gone. The old woman, having taught her lessons with a calm and steady hand, had left without any fanfare. The shooters who had once mocked her were now standing in quiet reverence, their minds racing with the lessons she had shared. They no longer saw the range as just a place to show off their skills or compete with each other. It had become something more, a place for growth, a place where the real challenge wasn't about hitting a target, but about mastering oneself. The young man who had doubted her the most stood at the far end of the range, rifle in hand, staring at the target. His fingers, once shaky, were now steady. His stance, once awkward and unsure, was now confident. But more than that, it was calm. He remembered the words the woman had shared with him: how to control the pressure, how to stay focused when everything else seemed out of control. He took a deep breath, just as she had taught him. The wind had picked up again, and the target seemed as distant as ever. But he didn't rush. He remembered her advice: don't force the shot. Wait for the right moment. His eyes were locked on the target now. Everything else faded into the background. The sound of the wind, the distant chatter of other shooters, even the heavy feeling in his chest, it all disappeared. All that remained was the target, the rifle, and his steady breath. He exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger just as the old woman had shown him. The shot rang out, the sound sharp and clear. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the target fell, the bullet hitting the center with a perfect precision. A smile spread across the young man's face, not out of pride, but out of realization. He had done it. And it wasn't just the shot that mattered, it was the process. The patience, the control, the calmness. These were the things that had made the difference. He had taken a step closer to mastering not just shooting, but himself. The other shooters, who had been watching from a distance, walked over slowly. They had seen the young man's transformation, and now they were eager to learn more. They approached him quietly, their eyes filled with curiosity and respect. "Do you feel it now?" one of them asked. "The difference?" "The control." The young man nodded slowly, still feeling the rush of the perfect shot. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "It's not just about the shot. It's about everything leading up to it. It's about controlling the chaos inside your head." Another shooter, a woman with short brown hair, looked thoughtful. "I never thought about it that way. I've always focused on hitting the target, but now I see it's about finding balance." The group nodded in agreement, each one reflecting on what they had learned that day. The old woman had shown them something far more valuable than any shooting technique. She had shown them the power of control, of patience, and of being calm under pressure. One by one, the shooters returned to their stations, each one focused more than ever before. They took their time, breathing deeply, adjusting their stance. It wasn't about speed. It wasn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about being in the moment, feeling the stillness, and trusting in their training. The young man who had once mocked the old woman was now the most focused of all. He wasn't worried about showing off or proving anything. He was focused on the process, the feel of the rifle in his hands, the steady rhythm of his breath, and the calm certainty that followed each shot. As the day wore on, the group of shooters continued their practice. They each took their turns, slowly but surely improving with each shot. They weren't in a rush anymore. They had learned to slow down, to take their time, and to respect the art of shooting in a way they hadn't before. By the time the sun began to set, casting a soft glow across the range, the shooters gathered together, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They stood in a loose circle, their faces filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The young man, who had become something of a leader among them, turned to the group. "I think we've all learned something important today," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It's not about being the best. It's about being in control. It's about knowing when to act and when to wait." The others nodded in agreement, each one reflecting on their own progress. The old woman, though she was long gone, had left an indelible mark on them. She had taught them that true skill wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about mastering themselves. As the group slowly packed up their gear, the young man couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward the woman who had changed everything for him. He didn't know where she had come from or where she had gone, but he was thankful for the lessons she had shared. Without her, he might still be lost in his own arrogance, rushing to prove himself instead of learning how to control his mind. He glanced over at the target, where the last of his shots had left a perfect hole in the center. He felt no need to rush to the next target. No need to prove anything. He was content. The others shared the same sense of peace. They were no longer competing with each other. They were no longer focused on being the best. Instead, they were focused on being better than they had been before. They had learned that skill wasn't just about the speed of your shot or the strength behind it. It was about having the patience to wait for the right moment, the wisdom to know when to act, and the control to remain calm in the face of pressure. As they left the range, each one of them carried a lesson with them, a lesson about patience, self-control, and the quiet strength that came from mastering not just the rifle, but themselves. The shooting range had returned to its usual rhythm after the old woman's lesson. The shooters had settled into a new routine, their focus sharper, their movements more controlled. They were no longer just firing at the targets, they were trying to master every detail, their stance, their grip, their breath. The young man who had challenged the woman earlier was no longer the cocky, overconfident shooter he once was. Instead, he was focused, taking slow, deliberate shots, each one improving ever so slightly. The woman, having given her lessons and shared her wisdom, remained a quiet observer. She was no longer the subject of mockery, but a figure of respect. The other shooters, once eager to dismiss her, now sought her advice, asking for tips, looking for guidance. She didn't say much, but when she did, her words were precise, cutting through the noise like the sharpest of arrows. "I've seen enough," she said softly, looking at the group of shooters now scattered across the range, all deeply immersed in their training. "You've all learned something today. But the real challenge is keeping that focus when the pressure is on." The young man who had spoken to her the most approached again. He was still holding his rifle, though now his hands were steady. He was a different person than when he first mocked her. His arrogance had melted away, replaced by a quiet determination. He was eager to learn more, to understand the deeper meaning behind her words. "You're right," he said. "We've all been focused on the mechanics, the stance, the grip, the breath. But how do you stay focused when everything's on the line? When the stakes are high, and there's pressure to succeed?" The old woman looked at him, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of experience. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the far-off target, which now seemed like a tiny dot in the distance. The wind had picked up, and the air was thicker with tension. "The real test," she began, "is when the conditions aren't perfect. When the target is far, the wind is strong, and your body is tired. It's easy to focus when everything is calm, when you're at your best. But the true test of skill is when everything else falls apart and you still have to stay calm. You have to find your center, no matter what's happening around you." She paused, letting her words sink in. The young man nodded, understanding that this was a deeper lesson than he had expected. "You see," the woman continued, "it's not about being the best shot in the room. It's not about how fast or how strong you are. It's about being in control when everything feels out of control." The young man looked down at his rifle, thinking about her words. He had always prided himself on his speed and precision, but now he saw that those qualities alone weren't enough. There was something deeper he needed to master. The old woman looked around at the group of shooters. "All of you, listen closely," she said, her voice carrying with a quiet authority. "You've learned the basics. But to truly master something, you need to go beyond technique. You need to learn how to manage the pressure." She motioned toward the young man, who was now standing with his rifle, looking out at the target. "I'll show you what I mean," she said. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate. She didn't rush, nor did she show any sign of hurry. The young man followed her lead, stepping beside her as she took her position at the shooting station. The others watched intently, their eyes following her every move. The woman adjusted the scope on her rifle, her fingers moving with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The wind was stronger now, and the target seemed even further away. But she wasn't concerned with those things. She was focused on something deeper. The young man, watching her carefully, could sense the difference in the way she held herself. There was no rush. There was no tension. Just calm. She raised the rifle slowly, taking aim at the target. The young man, standing beside her, felt his heart begin to race. The wind was picking up. His fingers itched to pull the trigger, but he stayed still, watching. She hadn't pulled the trigger yet. She was waiting. "Patience," the old woman whispered. "Patience is the key. You wait until the moment feels right, until everything aligns. Don't force the shot." The young man tried to follow her advice. He breathed deeply, steadying his hands. But the wind continued to howl, and the target seemed so far away. His thoughts raced. Should he take the shot now? Was he ready? But then, just as he felt the urge to pull the trigger, he saw her finger tighten on the trigger of her own rifle. She fired, and the sound of the shot rang out sharply, piercing the air. The bullet hit the target dead center. The young man stared in disbelief. He had felt the pressure, the uncertainty. But she had remained calm. She hadn't rushed. She had waited for the perfect moment, and when it came, she acted with precision. That, she said softly, is what it means to be in control. The others were silent. They had witnessed something powerful, something that transcended mere technique. The woman had shown them that the true power of a shooter wasn't in how fast they could pull the trigger or how quickly they could hit the target. It was in their ability to stay calm, to manage the pressure, and to wait for the right moment. The young man, still holding his rifle, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The tension in his body had relaxed. He understood now. It wasn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about being in control, regardless of the conditions. As the old woman began to pack up her things, the young man turned to her once again. "Thank you," he said. "I think I understand now. It's not just about skill, it's about staying calm under pressure. It's about controlling your mind, not just your body." The woman nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're learning," she said, her voice warm but still carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "Now, you have to practice. Every time you step onto the range, remember this lesson. The more you practice, the better you'll get at controlling not just your rifle, but your mind." With that, she turned and made her way toward the exit, her steps measured and steady, just as they had been throughout the entire lesson. The shooters around her watched in awe, their respect for her growing with every passing moment. As the woman left the range, they all stood there in silence, reflecting on the lessons she had taught them. They had come to the range expecting to learn about shooting, but instead, they had learned something far more important: how to control themselves when everything around them was chaotic. The woman's presence, her calmness, her wisdom, these were the things that had left an indelible mark on them. And as they went back to their shooting stations, they knew that her lessons would stay with them long after she had left. He stood, staring at the target where her bullet had hit dead center, as if it were some kind of miracle. The other shooters were still processing the fact that an elderly woman had just shown them all up. They were experienced, skilled, and proud of their shooting abilities, yet here she was showing them that there was so much more to the sport than just youthful strength and arrogance. The woman, who had remained quiet all this time, finally spoke. "You can't rush skill," she said, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the silence. "It takes patience. It takes practice. But most importantly, it takes respect for the gun, for the target, and for your own abilities." The young man who had challenged her earlier felt a deep sense of humility wash over him. His earlier mockery felt so distant now, almost foolish. He had thought of her as weak, out of place, maybe even a burden. But now he saw her as someone who had lived a life full of experiences he could never imagine. He took a deep breath, realizing just how much he still had to learn. He hesitated for a moment before walking up to her. Could you teach me?" he asked, his voice soft but genuine. "I mean, I thought I knew what I was doing, but I see now. I still have a lot to learn." The old woman turned toward him, her eyes warm but knowing. "It's not about teaching you in a single lesson. It's about showing you the way. The rest, you'll have to find on your own." She glanced at the other shooters, who were now gathered around her, all waiting for her next move. The young man's request was not an isolated one. It seemed everyone wanted to learn from her now. She raised an eyebrow, as though considering something. Then she slowly nodded. "All right," she said, "I'll show you the basics. But first, you need to forget everything you think you know about shooting." The young man looked confused, but he didn't speak. He was willing to listen. The others gathered around as the old woman moved to the center of the range, where a large target stood at a moderate distance. It wasn't too far, but far enough to present a challenge. She turned to face the group. "First thing you need to understand," she began, "is that it's not about the power of the shot. It's not about speed. It's about control. If you can't control your weapon, if you can't control your breath, then it doesn't matter how good you are at aiming. You'll miss every time. The shooters, who had once thought her a joke, now hung on her every word. The air was thick with attention, each person eager to absorb the wisdom she was offering. "Look at the target," she said, pointing to the far-off bullseye. "The first mistake many make is focusing on the target too much. They fixate on hitting the center, and that's when they lose focus on everything else. Instead, you should focus on your grip, your stance, and your breathing. If you get those right, the target will almost hit itself." She demonstrated, holding her rifle with a steady grip, her stance wide and grounded. Then she began to breathe deeply, slowly, making sure each breath was calm and controlled. The others watched, mimicking her movements, trying to follow her lead. She let the silence fill the air, only breaking it with soft words of instruction. "Your breath is your anchor," she explained. "Inhale deeply, hold it for a moment, and then exhale slowly as you squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk the shot. Don't rush it. Let it come naturally. If you're too eager, you'll miss. But if you're patient, if you wait until everything feels right, then the shot will come." The shooters tried to follow her advice, some with more success than others. The young man, who had challenged her earlier, was the first to take his shot. He lined up the rifle with the target, took a deep breath, and exhaled slowly. When he pulled the trigger, the bullet hit the outer ring of the target. He turned to the woman, a little surprised. I did it. I didn't miss," he exclaimed. She nodded. "Good. But don't get too excited. You've just taken your first step. There's still a long way to go." The other shooters began to take their turns, each one focusing on their breath and their stance. Some missed, some got closer to the center, but all of them felt the shift. They were no longer just firing shots. They were focused on their technique, their control, and they could feel the difference. The woman watched them all, her calm demeanor never changing. She didn't need to say much more. Her presence alone, her quiet confidence, had taught them more than any words could. She had shown them that shooting wasn't just about pulling a trigger, it was about discipline, patience, and respect for the craft. As the shooters continued their practice, the old woman began to pack up her things. Her rifle was neatly placed in its case, and she made sure everything was in order before standing up. She turned to the group, her face softening into a smile. "You've all made progress today," she said. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Don't think you've learned it all in one session. Keep practicing. Keep learning. And never stop respecting the craft. It will always be there, waiting for you." The young man who had mocked her earlier nodded earnestly. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I can't believe I ever doubted you." The old woman just smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "That's the thing about life," she said. "We all make mistakes. The important part is learning from them." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the shooters behind, their minds buzzing with the lessons she had shared. They had come to the range expecting to teach and to compete. Instead, they had been humbled by a woman who had shown them what true skill looked like, not in arrogance or boasting, but in quiet confidence and hard-earned wisdom. As they stood there, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance, they all knew one thing for sure: they would never underestimate someone based on their age, appearance, or experience again. His friends chuckled, the sound of their laughter ringing through the room. It wasn't cruel, just typical of the friendly mockery they often exchanged with one another, but they didn't know how wrong they were. The elderly woman, who had heard the whispers, didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She walked up to the counter with the same calm demeanor, pulling out her membership card and placing it on the counter. The silence that followed the woman's shot was heavy, almost suffocating. The shooters, who moments ago had been laughing and mocking her, were now standing still, eyes wide with disbelief. No one dared to speak. They stared at the target, then back at the old woman, who was calmly setting her rifle down, almost as if she had just completed any ordinary task. The young man who had been the loudest in his ridicule stood frozen. His smile had vanished, replaced by a look of shock. He had expected to see the woman miss, or perhaps make a mess of her shot. But instead, she had done what he, and everyone else in the room, had thought impossible. Her bullet had hit the center of the target from an impressive distance. As the realization of what had happened sank in, the air in the shooting range shifted. The room was no longer filled with the familiar sounds of confident shooters taking aim and joking with one another. Instead, it was filled with an awkward silence. The young man who had mocked her slowly lowered his rifle, still unable to process what had just occurred. His friends, who had been eagerly watching, exchanged unsure glances, unsure whether to applaud or retreat in embarrassment. The old woman, however, remained calm. Her hands, though aged, moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of shooting. She adjusted her bag on the table and, without a word, began to reload her rifle. The silence hung thick in the air until one of the younger shooters, a woman with a bright pink vest, hesitantly spoke up. That was impressive," she said, her voice faltering a little. Her words were barely audible, but they cut through the tension, and the others, almost as if on cue, nodded in agreement. The old woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she focused on her rifle, loading another round into the chamber. She took her time, as if the entire situation was nothing more than a brief interruption in her day. The shooters around her, who had once looked down on her, were now watching with a mixture of awe and confusion. They had no idea who she was, but her actions spoke louder than any introduction. The young man, still standing next to her, cleared his throat. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, his voice a little shaky now. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by an uncertain tone. "I thought you were just here to have some fun." The old woman turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that made him feel even more uneasy. "Fun, you say?" she asked softly. "No, my friend. This is not about fun. It's about precision. It's about focus. It's about the art of doing something so well that it becomes second nature." The young man blinked, his previous confidence slipping away further. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, mocking her without a second thought. Now, he felt small in comparison. "You're a expert?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, but it wasn't an arrogant smile. It was a gentle, knowing smile. "You could say that," she replied, not elaborating further. She wasn't interested in boasting. Her actions spoke for themselves. The group of shooters gathered around her now, their curiosity piqued. One by one, they exchanged glances, trying to come to terms with the fact that this elderly woman, whom they had written off as inexperienced and weak, was in fact a master of the craft they so proudly claimed as their own. The young man who had mocked her earlier finally managed to speak again, his voice carrying a hint of respect. "I apologize," he said, his tone sincere. "I shouldn't have doubted you." The old woman nodded slightly, acknowledging his apology but saying nothing in return. She wasn't one for words, her actions had already spoken louder than any apology could. For a moment, the group of shooters stood in uncomfortable silence. The change in atmosphere was palpable. They had come to the range expecting to show off their skills, to prove themselves to one another. But now, they felt like amateurs in the presence of someone who had clearly mastered the art of shooting. The woman, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the attention. She continued to reload her rifle, her movements smooth and precise. After a few moments, the young man who had first approached her stepped forward again. Would you mind showing us how you do it?" he asked, his voice now filled with genuine curiosity. I mean, we could all learn something from you. The old woman paused, considering his request. Then, without saying a word, she stood up and took her rifle in hand. She didn't speak, but the shooters around her instinctively took a step back, giving her the space she needed. They were no longer mocking her, they were in awe of her. She carefully adjusted the scope on her rifle, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had practiced this gesture thousands of times. As she aimed at the target once more, the young man who had challenged her earlier found himself holding his breath. There was something about the way she moved that commanded respect. Her confidence was not born from arrogance, but from years of experience, from the quiet understanding that she was capable of achieving something few others could. The woman pulled the trigger again, and the sound of the shot rang through the range once more. This time, the bullet hit its mark even more perfectly than before. The target was struck with a force that left no doubt in anyone's mind. This was no accident. This was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The young man who had doubted her earlier felt a pang of admiration, mixed with a sense of shame. He had underestimated her because of her age, because of the way she looked. He had assumed she was just a fragile old woman who had no business being on the range. But now, standing before him, was someone who had proven him wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The other shooters, once confident in their own abilities, now looked at the old woman with respect. They knew they had been in the presence of someone extraordinary. She was not just a shooter, she was a living legend, someone who had spent decades honing her craft. They realized that they had been foolish to judge her based on her appearance. The old woman had proven that skill and experience were not limited by age. And as she calmly stood there, watching as the shooters around her continued to process what had just happened, the old woman couldn't help but smile to herself. She had not come here to show off, to prove a point. She had simply come to enjoy the quiet peace of the range. But in doing so, she had taught these young shooters a lesson they would never forget: never underestimate someone based on their appearance or their age. The young man who had once mocked her stood silent, his respect for her growing with every passing moment. And as the other shooters began to murmur among themselves, the old woman stood quietly in their midst, her reputation solidified in ways that words never could have achieved. "I'm here to shoot," she said quietly, her voice smooth but firm. The range attendant, a young woman with a quick smile, looked at the card and gave the old woman a once-over. The card seemed legit, but there was no way to tell if she really knew what she was doing. She had to ask. "Are you sure you want to join the range today?" she asked, a little confused by the woman's age. "It's pretty competitive here." The woman smiled, her wrinkles deepening around the corners of her eyes. "I'm sure," she replied. "I've been shooting for a long time." The attendant blinked. She didn't know what to make of it but passed the woman a rifle. Meanwhile, the shooters at the nearby lanes couldn't help but stare. Some of them whispered to each other, trying to hold in their laughter. The idea of an old woman shooting next to them, in the midst of their high-energy atmosphere, seemed almost comical. They had no idea who she was, or why she had chosen this particular day to show up. Maybe it was her first time at the range. Maybe she was just trying to fulfill some lifelong dream. The elitist shooters, who had spent years perfecting their aim, weren't worried. There was no way an old woman, with her frail frame, could keep up. "Don't you think she's a little too old for this?" one of them whispered to his friend as he lined up his next shot. The young man beside him shrugged, not paying much attention. The old woman, meanwhile, seemed to be taking everything in stride. She set her bag down on the table beside her shooting station. There was nothing about her that screamed, "I belong here," but she didn't care. Her movements were deliberate, calculated, as she unpacked her gear, her hands steady despite her age. She glanced at the target in front of her, evaluating the distance, the wind. Everything seemed perfectly normal to her, as if she had been here countless times before. As she adjusted the rifle, a few of the younger shooters began to make their way toward her, drawn by curiosity. One, a tall, muscular man with a confident air, leaned over to her side, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you know how to use that?" he asked, his grin wide. "It might be a bit much for you, Grandma." The old woman didn't flinch. Instead, she looked up at him and smiled, her expression serene yet knowing. "I've been using rifles like this since you were in diapers," she said calmly, her tone playful, but laced with experience. The man laughed, his friends joining in. "Sure you have, lady. You want a lesson? We can show you how to shoot. Maybe you'll hit something." His friends snickered, clearly enjoying the way they were intimidating her. But the woman didn't let their teasing get to her. She simply raised the rifle, looking through the scope. The range around her faded into background noise as she focused entirely on the target. The other shooters continued to laugh and joke, some of them even taking bets on how long it would take her to miss. Without saying another word, the woman aimed, her movements smooth and precise. She pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed throughout the range, loud and powerful. The young man who had mocked her flinched at the sound, expecting to see her miss, or at best, hit a corner of the target. But when the dust settled, everyone froze. The bullet had hit dead center, the small hole on the target marking the perfect shot. For a moment, there was complete silence. The group of shooters, once so confident in their superiority, stood frozen in shock. Even the younger man who had challenged her couldn't speak. He stared at the target, then back at the old woman, who hadn't so much as flinched when the shot rang out. Her calmness in the face of their mockery was astonishing. Finally, someone broke the silence. "What the hell?" one of the shooters said under his breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The others exchanged glances, their confidence slipping away, replaced by a mix of awe and embarrassment. The old woman, unfazed by the stunned silence, lowered her rifle. She gave a quiet smile, as if the whole scene was nothing more than a typical day at the range.